Welcome to Syntax. On this Monday Hasty Treat, we're all going to be talking about component CSS. What are the different approaches to authoring CSS inside of components, and in general, how that component-based CSS workflow can work within your application? We're going to be talking about all different types of approaches that people like and use, and just some of our thoughts on them and maybe what differentiates them. My name is Scott Tolinsky. I'm a developer from Denver, and with me, as always, is Wes Boss. What's up, Wes?
Hey, excited to talk about this. We're just going through a show called CSS Authoring Approaches, and I realized we're kind of all just talking about components with all of these. So we switched it to, we're all pretty much making components at the end of the day, right? Like even if it's a website or a web app, you're all just like thinking about, I'm working on this piece right now.
The header,
global
the footer.
CSS, yeah. But there's many ways to sort of get that job done. So we're going to go through all of those today.
Yeah, there's what did they say, 100 ways to skin a cat? I love that neither of us are good at saying, so I'm just going to go with...
Yeah, something like that.
100 ways to skin... There are more than one... Oh, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's 100. I would not be able to figure that out if there was 100.
I don't even want one way, if we're being entirely honest. But I do want one way to solve my bugs, and that is Sentry.io, the perfect place to solve all of your bugs, but not just your bugs, your performance issues, anything that you might have in your application. It gives you visibility to fix the things before they become a problem. It really empowers you as a developer to solve your problems, to make better things without having to really worry about what's happening, who's it's affecting, whatever. You get all of that and more. So check it out, Sentry.io/syntax. Sign up and get 2 months for free. It's just an incredible service. So CSS, components, authoring systems. Let's talk about first and foremost, what makes, a good component system for CSS. And one of the things that for me is really a must-have for component-based CSS is being able to, and I know you don't even have this in the notes here, number one for me is being able to scope things if I need to scope to a component itself, to scope to several components wide. You can scope from a very wide range to a very narrow range. And that to me is one of the essential features of component-based CSS.
Other things is a reusable component is obviously good. You want to be able to define whether it's a card, whether it's a avatar, whether it's a button, you want to be able to define the CSS for that button and to be able to reuse that consistently throughout the website. So no matter where you put that thing, it's going to look exactly the same. It should also provide an API for predefined styles. Good component CSS is half of it is just about being consistent, right? Because that's why websites tend to get messy and sort of run away from you when you have too many different tweaks here or there. Like you can kind of feel that when you go on, like PayPal is a great example of this. If you go on PayPal's website, I know I always rip on PayPal, but I'm coming off a bit of a couple of rough weeks with them.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
You go to their website and like some of the stuff, it looks a little bit different than the other stuff, and the spacing is a little bit odd, and then randomly there's just like Times New Roman font somewhere, and you can tell that likely, and this is just part of having a very large backlog and a very large company, but you can tell that there's not a great way to choose from predefined style. So limiting the selection is often a frustration, but it's a benefit to a component of you can just choose from a set of predefined colors, sizes, font sizes, breakpoints, light and dark, things like that.
Yeah, it's systematizing your things in CSS, because if you show up to a component and you write background color, pound F3, F whatever, and then you do font size 16 on this thing and whatever, and then all of a sudden you change globally some of those things, or even you have global things already for that, you now have to go in so many places anytime you've authored exceptions, overrides, and things like that. So exceptions and overrides to the system need to be very intentional and very purposeful rather than something you're just willy-nilly tossing around. Another one is they need to be composable, especially in componentized world. We often talk about components as being Lego pieces, right? You can put them together. And one of the cool things about Lego pieces is many a times you can put the alien head on top of the golfer's body. You can put a door onto a spaceship. You can do that, and it works. And so they need to be composable in a way that it all works, right? If you're, like you have as an example here, if an avatar goes inside of a card and that card could possibly be inside of a table, that all needs to adjust.
I know you said this, but real quick, variations and overrides, allowing for them, that's a kind of delicate dance because allowing for too easy of override will cause like splintering of your styles throughout your website, and that doesn't look good. But you also do need to sometimes allow for variation where, I do need to be able to put a different border on this thing because of this specific use case. And the last one we have here is just dead code elimination, or like, in my opinion, a good CSS component system will only bundle the CSS that is actually used. If you're looking at your CSS somewhere and you say, am I using this CSS on the page? How do you answer that, right? Is it, well, I can search for the class throughout my thing, or I don't know what's being used and what's not being used. Better ship it all. That's how you get really bloated bundles of CSS at the end of the day. Whereas, like, we've sort of solved that in JavaScript land, where you simply just require the JavaScript you need. And if you stop requiring something, if you stop using a component, then all of the dependencies of that component will no longer be thrown into the bundle. If you just have one big CSS file, you might not necessarily know that.
Yeah, and that's what I love about writing your styles in a component, whether that is in a single file component system or even just any way to keep those styles co-located with that component, because it makes that process much easier, right? If you load the component, you're loading the styles. And if you toss everything in a big global style sheet, you're just loading that the whole time, no matter what. Another thing that's really great about single file component with CSS is that many times it's easy for the system to tell you right then and there if an attribute selector is not being used. So like, for instance, I know Vue probably does this, Svelte does this. If you have changed your HTML and the CSS you have down below is no longer matching it, it will tell you with a warning in your IDE, but also in your check process, this style is not being used. And you can quickly know ahead, like, all right, why is this here still? Did I break something? Did it change? Do I need to modify it? It just helps you get a better understanding about what's going on inside of your CSS.
So before we get into it, I have a question for you is, how do you decide what is a component and what should just be part of a component? So for example, if you have like a heading of a show, and inside of that heading of a show, you want to put like a little pill that shows how long the show is, 52 minutes and 43 seconds. That pill itself is sometimes used in other places on the website. Do you have any process for figuring out when does something become just part of a component and when does something need to be its own component, which can be added and composed upon?
Yeah, some of that comes with practice and knowing what will bite you later down the line. I've had situations where sometimes a tag or a pill or something like that makes more sense to just be a class, like a single class. Is this thing really just a span with a class, or is it actually a component? Sometimes in my history as a web developer, I would make that span with a class a component and scope that 100% of the time. Nowadays, I would lean more towards a class for some things. That said, I do think it is a feel thing, and it also depends on how much this thing is going to be reused and how many variants of this they're going to be. Let's say you have a pill. That pill could have an icon. It could be different colors. It could have different sizes. Then I'm going to look into making that into a component with props to adjust those types of things. But if it's just a single span with some styles applied to it, sometimes a class is all you need there.
Yeah, but in your description there, that it kind of is its own component, because that's our first one, is just class-based components, meaning that instead of you saying like heading space span to select the span there, you're giving it its own class of like a pill. I would say that that's making its own component. You're not putting it in its own file and making it like a reusable. I guess it is reusable because if you wanted to use that somewhere else, you would just reuse that class, right?
Yeah, class is inherently reusable, and it's tough to, like, when we're talking about like a class-based component system.
Yeah,
it's tough to align that when we're talking about a React component or a Svelte component, right?
Yeah,
because they kind of feel, separate. With a class-based component system, one of the things you're doing is you're typically going to be authoring that style in a global manner, in a global CSS file. And it's much harder, I think, to do dead code elimination that way.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be loading that pill no matter what. Otherwise, like, how would you know you're bringing in that class only when a pill's used? Then you're probably already reaching for an actual, like, JavaScript component.
So the first one, class-based, is simply just you have an element, and maybe it's a card. You give it a class of card, and then you select the elements that are inside of that, right? And at a certain point, you'll think, okay, well, like, this is my card component, and this is the H2 class that goes inside of it, or a heading class that goes inside of it. At a certain point, you think, okay, I'm going to reuse that, or it doesn't make sense to tie these things together because it makes sense to put it in its own component. Pretty popular way to do this, and I know it's a little bit older, but I still see it used quite a bit on websites, is the BEM approach, which stands for Block Element Modifier. And the whole idea there is that you have your block, which is your main component. That might be a card. And then you have an element, which might be like your card heading. And then you have your modifier, which might be like card heading extra large, which is much larger than that. And there's many ways to sort of approach it. There's object-oriented CSS. There's simply just giving stuff classes and styling it how you want it. Especially now that we have nested CSS, this approach actually is a lot easier because you don't have to give absolutely everything a class. You can simply just write your nested CSS and it will be applied to the parent that's there.
Yeah, and this can get you into trouble if you nest too many things. You could be not taking advantage of the reusability properties of CSS, and next thing you know, you could be getting into a situation where your code is sopping wet. It's having a hard time where anytime you want to change anything, you got to worry about all of the different nested versions of this thing that you have written and scoped to those classes.
They look a little bit different. That's why the rule of thumb is everyone always says, like, don't nest deeper than 3. That's sort of a soft rule. There's plenty of situations where you would go there. But if you find yourself nesting more than 3 levels deep on something, you probably should ask yourself, should I stop? Should this be its own class? Should it be its own component?
Yeah. And for a long time, folks, if you're newer and you've only ever written React code or anything like that, for a long time, BEM was there was a couple other ones that were like really prominent, but BEM was really the law, essentially, if you wanted to write really well-defined CSS that was easy to update, easy to find. And honestly, I think that might have been some developers' introduction to actually working with something that could be considered a component, even if we didn't recognize it at the time, right? We had blocks.
Next approach we have here is CSS modules. The way that this works is you write your CSS for your component in a .module.css file. And what you then do, so you might have like a .card in there, and you simply, instead of adding a class to your markup with a class of card, you import that CSS into the component when you're writing your HTML or your JSX or whatever you're using for templating. And by simply importing that, you'll have access to all of the selectors from that file. So for example, if I have a card.module.css and I have a selector in there that's .card, I can then access the .card styles by saying import styles from card.css, and then you get a generated class name, which you can then pass in. So the reason we do that is so that everything is absolutely unique and scoped. You don't have to worry about overriding. Like if you have a class of card and then somebody else has a class of card in another module, it doesn't matter because the IDs at the end of the day are going to be generated and they're not globally available. So you simply just import it. It will give you a generated class name, which you can then apply to your markup. And then the added benefit to that as well is you get the really nice dead code elimination, because if you don't import a module, it's not making its way into your global bundle. I've not been a fan of CSS modules myself. I was actually surprised to see that like JavaScript has first-party support for that type of thing via the import spec. But I don't know. Have you ever been a fan of that?
I'm gonna say it straight up. I don't get it. I mean, I get it, but I don't get why you would like this. I don't like it. There's a lot I don't like about it. It just feels like so heavy-handed for what I expect to work. It feels like, you remember the first time you used Redux and you're like, man, this feels like too much work for what I'm doing. That's what it feels like to me. It's like I've written scoped CSS in a much cleaner way.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like I need to go the long way to do this
I
type
agree.
of thing.
And there's so many better approaches, in my opinion, that that's probably why I'm not a fan of it. So the next one we have here is scope CSS, which is probably, I would say, Scott and I's favorite in all of these use cases. Is that fair?
Yeah, you know what? I would say, as a blanket statement, just about all of these techniques are trying to solve the problem of scoping your CSS.
Yes.
Because now that we're building Lego pieces or blocks or things, now that we're building chunks, being able to say this chunk looks this way is like in the entirety of what we're doing with CSS in a component. So by default, all components scope their CSS in Svelte, and you have to specifically say that this CSS is global for any selectors that affect things outside of that component, which in itself is kind of a code smell, in that you're probably putting that into a global CSS file instead of using the global. I know some people might feel differently about that. Vue has a very similar concept, except for theirs is kind of the opposite, where you specify that CSS is scoped by using an attribute. So you throw an attribute on your style tag, and therefore that CSS will now be scoped. Web components, via the Shadow DOM, CSS is scoped to that component. And also, here's another huge one, big addition to CSS, and this is going to change things for a lot of people. In fact, I would imagine, and I don't have anything to suggest that I know this for certain, but I would imagine systems like Vue and Svelte are going to start using this technique once it's more widely available, and it's the @scope rule in CSS, which, surprisingly, I didn't know this, now has 82% browser support.
Wow.
With support in every browser, including Firefox behind a flag. So @scope is on the precipice here of being available to us all. And we'll have some links so you can check out how @scope works, but it's basically you use the @scope rule, and inside of parentheses, you're throwing the selector you want your CSS to be scoped to. You can also do donut scoping, where you have a limit, where that limit is, you could think of it as the bounds in which the scoping is applying, and you can apply CSS outside of that scope by going inside. It's a donut metaphor. Yeah.
Man, it just hit Chrome for Android, like at the time of recording, 3 or 4 weeks ago. So yeah,
I haven't looked at this in a while.
We're going to start seeing, we did a whole show on it, but at the time it was just hitting Chrome. But now taking a look at it, it's hitting Firefox very soon. It's been in Safari for 8-9 months already. So it's going to be a little bit more before we hit it. But I'm excited for this, specifically because one of the things I don't like about the way that Svelte does CSS is that if you have a component that applies some CSS, the CSS is only applied to the elements that are in that component. If you have a child component that maybe renders out a span or something like that, in order for you to style those, you have to move the CSS to that component, which in most cases is a good use case. But every now and then I'm like, no, I just want to be able to style the children with this class name.
Yes, the children is the thing, yeah.
Inside of the parent, I want to apply some styles to it, and it doesn't work unless you explicitly global it. But with the CSS @scope, there is this idea called the donut scope. So by default, scope will go start where you want it, and it'll go all the way down, which is maybe not what you want, because you could apply some CSS to a card component, and then all of that card components, like let's say you style a span or something, it's going to go all the way down to every single element that is inside of it, and it will not stop. But you can use until in the CSS scope. It's called donut scope. So you can define where it starts and stops. So you can explicitly stop the cascade from going on down.
Yeah, it's so funny when you were saying it goes down, you did like this, but in reality, it's more like this, right? Because you're narrowing as you go down, right?
Oh yeah, I was doing this, like the DOM tree going
the DOM
down.
tree. I'm thinking like this, and then you could think of donut scoping as you're just like shaving off that point there, or something like that. Yeah, if we're doing calculus here or whatever. So, okay, CSS in JavaScript is also a big strategy for this type of thing. And many people had an introduction to this with something like styled components, where you're writing CSS in a string in a template tag literal, and that just becomes your whole component. The component could have props that you could then use to modify your CSS, which largely that technique is being replaced by CSS variables. But it's a simple way to create a quick component that expresses CSS and scopes it directly to that component. At one point in time in my life, Wes, I had a capital H1, H2, H3 components. I had a P component. I had an A component, and it got exhausting doing all of that. So nowadays, CSS-in-JS has changed a little bit, given that, we have different types of platforms out there. You took a little bit of a look at Panda. I don't know much about Panda. How is it different than styled components?
So styled components, and I'll say the rest of them, like there's emotion and there's lots of styled components sort of was the big one, right? The way that they worked is they were all runtime, meaning that they had to run in the browser, and then it would apply the styles to your page, right? And Panda is like, we don't really necessarily need it at runtime anymore, because in order to make your CSS dynamic, you just use CSS variables now, right? There's very few use cases where you would actually need dynamic CSS. And if that's the case, if you really do need dynamic CSS, then just put it in a style prop on your component, right? Just use an inline style or an inline style object. So people just really like style components because it gave you the sort of the same experience as Svelte does, is I would just make my div above my actual component, and I would say like style.div, and I put all the CSS in it, and then right below it, I do the actual like functional component of like, what does it do and how does it handle click handlers and whatnot. And I'd be able to have them in the same file if I wanted to, or I could just throw it into another file and make it reusable again, right? It's just a nice way to scope it, nice way to author it. With Panda now...
scope wrapper, really. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. With Panda, they provide a whole bunch of stuff, right? That they have some stuff around design systems. They have a lot of like helper patterns as well, which is both you can make components where you can reuse them, but also they have helpers for making stacks of content. So instead of having like a display grid and putting a gap between each of them, they have this idea of like an H stack, a reusable. Everyone's building this, right? And there's circle, there's center, there's a whole bunch of helper patterns along with that. And the kicker is that Panda runs at build time, meaning that it's no longer a runtime thing like style components is. And both with server components as well as people realizing I don't need my CSS to be computed at runtime, it's really nice just to do that all at build time.
Yeah,
so
totally.
The Panda API and CSS-in-JS APIs can look a few different ways. Like you can have tag template strings, which is my favorite because it looks like you're writing CSS. You can write the same CSS you're used to, all the nesting works, all of the stuff you're used to in CSS works in CSS-in-JS. But then there's also popular ways of using a prop-based API. So you have like a card component, and if you want to specify properties of that card, you would just pass in like size equals 12. Radix UI is similar to this as well. Instead of passing CSS, you're just passing properties that have been predefined. You can pass across. And then finally, you can also pass style objects as well, which I've never been a fan of myself.
Same.
Writing your CSS as a JavaScript object, I understand that you can get used to it, but I rather write my CSS as CSS.
Yeah, you can move CSS as CSS places, where if CSS is an object, you're limited to keeping it as an object forever. I guess now with LLMs, you could probably tell it just to convert it for you, or maybe there's extensions to do that type of thing.
Yeah, there is, but it's still. And also the Facebook one as well, which was, we did a whole show on it.
Stylex.
Stylex, yeah. they do a similar way where Stylex will have an object of the properties and pass it along. And a lot of people are like, I don't like writing my CSS that way, but everyone's like, you get used to it.
Yeah, I'm going to say I don't get this one either. I've never gotten it. I know JS people or even like actual developers who don't like CSS, I think gravitate to this a lot more. But folks who got their start writing CSS, HTML, those types of things, I've never gotten the argument for using the objects unless of course
especially you have like a code pen you find and you want to use that CSS in yours.
You got to convert it.
It's just that's annoying. But next one we have here is utility CSS, which is instead of writing CSS as like a selector and all of your properties along with that, is you have a whole bunch of utility classes, Tailwind obviously being the very biggest one in this space, and you simply just apply all of so you want a border, you want rounded corners, you want font size, you apply classes that are associated with those style properties to your element directly. Sometimes they match one-to-one with what CSS is, but you kind of have to learn a new set of classes for it. And then it will also often include a bunch of helpers for things like spacing or adding rounded corners or light mode, dark mode, media, breakpoints, like different variants of that element that you have.
Yeah. And I guess some of the downsides here is obviously that you end up styling a lot in your classes, which can lead to wet code where you're just having the same classes being used. It can pollute kind of HTML. Those are some criticisms of something like this. It's no longer a utility if everything is a utility, I guess. But, there's a lot of upsides to it where you are able to define it's a system, right? The utilities are a system. And if you're using the system, that inherently makes for things that they work better together or they feel better together because it is obviously a system. I think there's a lot of interesting ones. There's Uno CSS as well, which is an on-demand atomic CSS engine where it gives you a little bit more customization in terms of what kind of classes you're actually shipping for your utilities and how that all works. I think there's a lot of really great things about utility CSS, a utility-based CSS. I do think there are some difficult things because one thing, the way that I look at this is that CSS itself is a very full-featured language. And when you move to a utility class-based DSL, which is what these things are, right?
Yeah.
You are at the whims of those classes now implementing CSS things. Now, granted, you can use normal CSS with Tailwind all you want. There's no problem there. But now you're mixing multiple approaches and you just have to think about, what the implications of all that is. So, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I think it's, different strokes for different folks. I just see that as like, I don't know. Do you want me to get into JS sprinkles here now?
Like real quick
or do you want to keep on this?
Like the Tailwind thing is I wrote my latest website in Tailwind as well. And I'm a big fan of it, mostly because of the ability to do arbitrary styles, meaning that you can sort of break out of the predefined situations. And also something like P-4, I don't know, how many pixels is that? I realize there's a scale and you can change it if you want to, but I much just rather prefer pass to rem or 25px or something like that. So, and I find myself I do have a fairly lengthy sort of breakout CSS file where I'm like, this is much easier to do in its own CSS file, adding a class to the thing rather than having to figure out what the equivalent is. And most of that stuff is a lot of the new CSS stuff that is coming. The container queries or even anytime there's anything new, there's a wondering of how could you possibly implement this in classes? And then again, it's a DSL at the end of the day. And I think with any DSL, knowing the ins and outs of a DSL is kind of and that's a domain-specific language for people that are not. Knowing the ins and outs of that is learning yourself. So if you already know CSS and these new features as CSS, now you have to learn a whole subset of this DSL to be able to work effectively. And so I think those are all just trade-offs you get with the power of the fact that you have a full system now that you didn't have to write from scratch. This Uno? I've not seen this Uno. What is this?
Oh, man. Guess who Uno is from?
Aunt Fu.
You could just tell by looking at this page, huh?
So what's the idea here?
it's less that you have a fully predefined utility system and more that you can create a utility system. So it's allowing you to create your own Tailwind-like system without having it be totally predefined for you.
Oh, I don't know. If I could make a good system, though, I would probably just make a mess.
You know what? I'll tell you what, making systems is one of my favorite things in the whole world. So this speaks to me if I wanted to use this type of thing.
Oh, okay. So
yeah,
it's kind of like if you were using Tailwind, but Tailwind came with nothing, and then you just made your own plugins at the end of the day. So their examples is like they're saying m dash whatever, and then you write your own resolver, and that will resolve to margin whatever dash px. So you can make your own system.
And the power of that is that anyone can publish their own preset, which is essentially their own theme for this type of thing. Okay. And because of that, it's like you're getting to use the same techniques but different themes. So you don't have to create it yourself. Like here's a Tailwind CSS and Windy CSS compatible preset. So you could use Uno, but still use the Tailwind like DSL language that you've like come to understand.
Cool. Well, we're going to have Antfu on the podcast. Very excited about that. So we'll have to get his thoughts on this.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
Let's talk about utility sprinkles because I think this is kind of what we're doing in the Syntax website. We mostly use scope CSS, but a lot of times it does make sense to use utility, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of largely my viewpoint on it. I think sometimes when I speak about utility-based CSS, people get the wrong opinion that I'm anti-utility-based CSS or something, and that's not the case. I love utility-based CSS. I just don't write all my styles with utilities. I use them for utilities, which is kind of what they were used before we all started using a lot of utilities. You use them for utility, right? So in my mind, you have your system, which is largely composed through CSS variables. You have your components, which is scoping your CSS. And then you have your utilities. We talked a little bit about like a pill. That might be not considered a utility, but what could be considered a utility is a class called grid. And that grid class allows you to it's not just applying a display grid on the thing. It could be applying your default grid. And it's just .grid, and it's your default grid. It's not anybody else's default grid. And the reason why I like this utility sprinkles approach is because the utilities that you end up having, they can be a system that you're used to. They can be the same thing on every project, but the internal CSS that's attached to those utilities can change. Like if I want the default grid for the syntax site to be always 3 columns and whatever, and anytime I apply .grid, it's like that. Or anytime I apply .layout, it does this or that. But then on another site, I want that grid to be slightly different. You can take those with you, modify the CS inside of them, then you have utilities for when you want a layout or when you want a grid, but it's not somebody else's predefined thing. And not only that, if I want a grid that's X amount of columns by X amount, I don't have to bring in other classes. I just get to use, this is my grid, you know?
And I'll tell you, the first utility classes I added to the Syntax website was text classes, because we have variables for all of the things, and we have all of our typography is kind of preset as well, right? We globally define what H1 through H6 looks like. We define what text looks like, right? All of those situations. But there are many use cases where we want to make text slightly larger or smaller. And I was finding it to be a bit of a pain to have to write an H3 tag, then go down, open up some style tags, select the H3 tag, and then say font size, var, dash, text, dash, dash, whatever, you know? So we just made a whole bunch of utility classes, text, dash, extra small, small, base, medium, large, extra large, double XL, etc. Text left, text center, text right, text justify, text start, text end. These are all just nice little helper classes you can pop on any text that you're writing, and there's no need to select it or even open style tags, because there's a lot of components we have that don't even have style tags in them. It's simply just markup.
Yeah, totally. All right, so the last thing here is how do CSS variables come into play? You know, some systems are entirely variable-based. Open props, which is open-props.style from Anna Margall, is an entirely CSS variable-based system. And other times you're using a system as a design token. Now, design token is a deep topic. I'm just going to say a design token generally, at a wide view design token, folks, is like These are the variables that your application's using for the system, right? You can think your colors, your primary, those types of things. The variables end up being even the global variables. The variables of the system are your design tokens. High level, font sizes, colors, light, dark. Anytime you're having things that are this is how your application can be. These are the constraints of your CSS. They go inside of variables, and then you're able to use those variables. I had a good friend of mine who worked at Google who said his rule for CSS variables is never have font sizes or colors ever defined in your CSS. There were some other things there too, but those were two of his big ones, is that they had style-int rules that if you ever had a font size or a color that was not a variable, that it would fail because there's a system.
Then you're sidestepping the system and putting your own value in there. Interesting. What else do we have here? Often CSS variables are used as arguments for your CSS. So if you have a grid and you want to change the number of columns or change the number of gaps, or if you want to, that's not even a very good example because you can just pass in how many it is. But if it's somehow computed, right? Like you have a base size and the rest of them are calced off of that, it often makes sense to put your arguments for your CSS of your component into a CSS variable so that you can override what the default arguments are by simply just either by passing in a inline style property or by having a utility class of commonly used things that will change the variable, which is what we use with our text. It's simply just text-sm will just change the variable to a specific value.
Yeah, you can think of them sometimes as props for your components with your variables. Cool. Well, that's all I have. This has been a very tasty-sized hasty. Yeah.
Probably could have squeezed the whole shot of this, but you're welcome. Little extra for you today.
Yeah, I love this kind of stuff, so I could go all day. So we will have to stop. If you have any more thoughts or questions or different approaches that we did not cover, leave a comment down below. And I'm talking about on YouTube, folks, youtube.com/@syntaxfm. That's the best place to let us know what you thought of the episode, or even, give us some ideas or things that we didn't think about or cover in the episode. So yeah, check it out, us on YouTube, all that good stuff. Let us know what you think. If you have a different approach or even a different library or something that we didn't cover here, would love to hear about it.
All right. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We will catch you later.
Peace.